Why the avoidant falls apart when the super empath walks away. When an avoidant loses the one person who loved them without conditions, it doesn't just sting, it shatters the illusion they've spent their whole life hiding behind. There's a moment, sharp, silent, and unforgettable, when the avoidant realizes the empath is truly gone, and in that moment, everything they thought they were protecting themselves from becomes the very thing they have to face. You see, the avoidant spends their life believing closeness is dangerous. They build walls, they keep their distance, they push away the very intimacy they crave, all while convincing themselves they're perfectly fine on their own. But then they meet the super empath, the person who sees them, who understands the emotional language they never learned to speak, who loves them gently enough that even their defenses feel safe for the first time. And here's the twist. The avoidant mistakes that love for permanence. They assume the empath will stay, no matter how cold they become, no matter how distant, no matter how many times they say, I don't need anyone. But the empath does something the avoidant never expects. They leave quietly, finally, decisively. And that's when the avoidant falls apart, not because they suddenly want intimacy, but because the person who gave them emotional safety, consistency, and understanding is no longer there to fill the emptiness they've been avoiding their entire life. The empath walking away forces the avoidant to confront a truth they never wanted to look at. It wasn't independence they were living in. It was fear. It wasn't strength. They were just numb. And it wasn't that they didn't need anyone. It's that they didn't know how to let anyone in. Losing the super empath doesn't just end the relationship. It exposes the wound the avoidant has been protecting for years. And for the first time, there's no one left to soothe what they refuse to heal. The avoidance collapse begins the moment the empath finally walks away, because up until that instant, the avoidant never truly believed the empath would leave. To understand why this hits so deeply, you have to look at the quiet assumptions the avoidant has been operating under from the very beginning. Avoidants often live with an internal script that says people don't stick around unless they're forced to, tricked to, or pressured. They don't trust connection, so they expect abandonment long before it happens. But with the empath, something strange occurs. The empath stays, not just physically, but emotionally, consistently, gently. The empath doesn't play games to get closeness, doesn't use manipulation, doesn't withdraw to punish. The empath simply shows up with warmth, patience, and understanding. Over time, the avoidant starts to believe, often unconsciously, that this presence is guaranteed. Not because the empath has promised forever, but because the empath has demonstrated a level of emotional endurance the avoidant has never seen before. The avoidant mistakes this endurance for permanence. They mistake empathy for obligation. And because the avoidant has built their entire identity around the belief that they're safer at a distance, they don't realize how much of their emotional stability has come to depend on the empath's steady presence. The empath becomes the emotional buffer between the avoidant and the world. The empath softens conflict, translates feelings, forgives the emotional cold spells, and offers reassurance when intimacy feels threatening. But the avoidant rarely acknowledges this, even to themselves. They simply feel more comfortable, less anxious, less triggered, without ever connecting the dots that it's the empath's constancy making that possible. So when the empath finally reaches their limit, when they've given, reassured, supported, and waited to the point of emotional exhaustion, their departure doesn't unfold with drama. It's quiet, clean, a door gently closing rather than slamming. And this is exactly why it devastates the avoidant so profoundly. They aren't prepared. In their mind, the empath was the one person who could absorb the impact of their detachment without breaking. The one person who could understand their fear and work around it. The one person who felt safe enough that they didn't have to change. When the avoidant looks up and realizes the empath is gone, it shatters the illusion they've lived in, the illusion that relationships can be maintained without emotional effort, without vulnerability, without reciprocity. The avoidant has spent years convincing themselves that needing someone is dangerous, that closeness is a threat, that relying on anyone invites disappointment. But with the empath, they allowed themselves a small, subtle reliance. They began to expect the empath's presence, like the sun rising, quietly, without question. Losing that steadiness feels like the ground disappearing beneath them. It's not just the loss of a person, it's the loss of the emotional safety the empath provided, the validation the empath offered, and the place where the avoidant could exist without being pushed to open up before they were ready. Their world suddenly feels harsher. People seem colder. Interactions feel more draining. All the emotional resilience the empath supplied in the background is gone, and the avoidant must now face the raw emotional landscape they once outsourced to the empath. And here's what hits hardest. The avoidant realizes the empath didn't leave because the avoidant wasn't enough. The empath left because the empath had finally given too much. That distinction cuts deeply. If the empath had left, angrily, loudly, or impulsively, the avoidant could dismiss it as drama or instability. But a silent exit from someone grounded, patient, and consistent forces the avoidant to see the truth. They pushed away someone who was willing to love them through their fears, but not at the expense of their own emotional health. The avoidance collapse comes from the sudden awareness of consequences. For so long, their distance felt safe because the empath kept bridging the emotional gap. But when the empath no longer crosses that distance, the avoidant is left standing alone with the reality that their walls didn't keep them safe. They pushed away the one person who made connection feel possible. The avoidant falls apart because they finally understand something they've avoided their entire life. People stay when they are loved, not when they are tolerated. People feel valued through connection, not through distance. And even the most resilient heart will walk away when it realizes it's loving alone. What makes the avoidant spiral internally is the sudden recognition that the empath's absence isn't punishment, it's self-protection. The empath didn't leave to wound them, the empath left to survive. This forces the avoidant to face reflection they've spent years avoiding. Their behavior has real impact. Their silence has weight. Their withdrawal hurts. And while they believed they were minimizing emotional chaos by keeping distance, they were actually creating a slow, quiet erosion of someone who loved them deeply. The avoidant isn't used to consequences that aren't delivered with anger or explosions. They're used to conflict they can shut down, detach from, or rationalize away. But a calm departure, a peaceful exit, that is something they cannot emotionally protect themselves from. It sinks in, it stays, it rewrites their internal script. For the first time, the avoidant has tea. Oh, grapple with the truth that the empath's presence was never guaranteed, and losing it means facing the loneliness they've been defending themselves against all along. Avoidants rely on the emotional safety that the super empath provides, often without ever acknowledging it, even to themselves. From the outside, avoidants appear detached, self-sufficient, and independent, as if they thrive in solitude and don't need anyone to validate or support them. But the truth is far more nuanced. The avoidance distance isn't a sign of emotional strength. It's a defense mechanism against intimacy. Deep down, they crave connection, but their fear of vulnerability convinces them that closeness is dangerous. The super empath, often unknowingly, becomes the person who fills the void the avoidant refuses to confront. They provide a consistent presence that allows the avoidant to operate in the world with a sense of stability, even as they maintain the illusion of emotional detachment. The empath's patience, understanding, and non-judgmental nature create an invisible safety net. The avoidant may not consciously recognize it, but the empath's presence softens the impact of life's emotional turbulence, buffering the avoidant from the chaos that intimacy often threatens to unleash. The super empath is uniquely attuned to the avoidant's inner world. They sense the subtle cues, the hesitations, the small retreats, and they respond not with anger or pressure, but with gentle understanding. They anticipate the avoidant's needs, not through manipulation, but through attunement and empathy. When the avoidant withdraws emotionally or physically, the empath doesn't panic, they wait patiently, offering quiet reassurance and steady presence. This creates a paradoxical dynamic. The avoidant appears independent, but they are secretly depending on the empath to manage the emotional labor they themselves cannot face. They rely on the empath to normalize the chaos of their internal world, to absorb their fears, and to stabilize the relationship. without requiring the avoidant to lower their walls. In this sense, the avoidant's perceived independence is, in fact, a quiet form of emotional dependency. They need the empath's patience and understanding to maintain the delicate balance that keeps them comfortable, even while believing they are fully self-sufficient. Because the avoidant doesn't consciously acknowledge this reliance, it becomes an unspoken truth that governs their behavior. They may push the empath away, act cold, or create distance, all while silently expecting that the empath will bridge the gap. This expectation is often unconscious, and that's what makes the eventual loss of the empath so destabilizing. The avoidant doesn't realize that their survival strategy, detachment, withdrawal, avoidance, is only viable because the empath has quietly been absorbing the tension and providing emotional scaffolding. Without the empath, the avoidant is forced to confront the rawness of their own fear and vulnerability. They are left standing in a space they never learned to navigate alone, and that sudden exposure to their own emotions can be overwhelming. The dynamics of this reliance are subtle. It's not a demand or a conscious manipulation. The avoidant isn't actively using the empath for emotional labor in a deliberate way. Rather, the empath's presence fills the gaps the avoidant refuses to fill themselves. When the avoidant encounters life's inevitable stressors, it is the empath's understanding, patience, and emotional attunement that keeps the avoidant from being overwhelmed. The avoidant may continue to act detached, may refuse to share feelings, and may resist intimacy, but the empath's consistency creates a sense of unspoken safety. This allows the avoidant to function without having to fully engage with their own vulnerability. They are, in essence, outsourcing emotional safety, not because they are selfish or malicious, but because facing their own emotional depths is terrifying. The empath quietly carries the weight, enabling the avoidant to live as if their detachment is harmless or self-sufficient. The avoidant's reliance is also reinforced by a pattern of intermittent reinforcement. The empath doesn't withdraw arbitrarily, they are steady and reliable, yet they do have limits. This reliability teaches the avoidant that closeness can be safe, but because the empath does not react to every withdrawal with judgment or frustration, the avoidant interprets this as freedom. They can retreat without fear of catastrophic consequences, and this reinforces the idea that the relationship is under their control. The avoidant can maintain their independence while still benefiting from the empath's emotional labor. Over time, this creates a hidden dependency. The avoidant has come to rely on the empath's patience and presence to navigate the emotional landscape, but they continue to believe that they are the ones in control. Yet this hidden dependency is fragile. The avoidant's reliance is unacknowledged and unreciprocated in equal measure. They are getting emotional support without having to engage in vulnerability themselves. This imbalance cannot last indefinitely. The empath, despite their patience, eventually senses the weight of carrying the emotional labor alone. The empath has needs too, and when those needs are consistently unmet, their capacity to provide emotional safety begins to erode. The avoidant, still unaware of the reliance they have developed, is suddenly faced with a vacuum. The safety net that has been silently stabilizing them is removed, leaving them exposed to the very fears and anxieties they have avoided. On fronting for years, when the empath steps back or walks away, the avoidant experiences the collapse in a way that feels sudden and overwhelming. The reliance that was never recognized becomes painfully apparent. They realize that their apparent independence was conditional on the empath's presence. They understand, often too late, that the emotional safety they took for granted was never theirs to control. It was a gift, freely given, and it could be withdrawn. The avoidant is forced to confront the truth that their coping mechanisms, which they believed protected them, only functioned because someone else was absorbing the emotional burden they could not carry themselves. This realization is destabilizing, disorienting, and often traumatic for the avoidant because it forces them to acknowledge a dependency they were never ready to admit, let alone navigate on their own. This dynamic illustrates the paradox of the avoidant-empath relationship. The avoidant clings to detachment as a form of self-protection, yet their very detachment is only sustainable because of the empath's emotional labor. They rely on the empath without acknowledging it, creating a hidden dependency that is both necessary and dangerous. The avoidant may continue to believe they are independent, self-sufficient, and emotionally invulnerable, but when the empath finally reaches their limit and steps away, the fragile foundation the avoidant has been standing on collapses. The avoidant must confront the emotional truth they have spent their life avoiding. They cannot navigate intimacy or vulnerability alone, and their survival strategy has been silently dependent on someone else's unwavering patience and love. The empath's departure forces the avoidant to face their lifelong fear of vulnerability, revealing that they were driven by emotional avoidance, not true independence. Avoidants often pride themselves on self-sufficiency, presenting a persona of control, strength, and detachment. They tell themselves and anyone who will listen that they do not need others, that intimacy is dangerous, and that relying on someone else is a weakness. On the surface, it appears as though they navigate life with confidence and composure, but beneath that polished exterior lies a constant undercurrent of fear of being hurt, fear of being consumed by emotions they do not know how to process, and fear of losing themselves in the process of connecting with another person. The presence of the super empath masks these fears. The empath provides a steady, unconditional acceptance that allows the avoidant to function in relationships without confronting the raw truth of their own emotional landscape. The empath absorbs the intensity of the avoidant's withdrawal, meets their detachment with patience rather than frustration, and creates a space in which the avoidant can maintain distance without consequence. When the empath finally walks away, the avoidant is stripped of that buffer. Suddenly, the strategies that they believed protected them, walls, withdrawal, emotional detachment, offer no defense against the reality of absence. For the first time, the avoidant is forced to confront the truth they have been avoiding for years, that their so-called independence was not independence at all, but avoidance. Their emotional armor, which seemed so impenetrable, crumbles in the face of the empath's departure. They realize, often with shock, that they had been hiding not from the empath or the world, but from themselves. The fear of vulnerability they had been managing indirectly through avoidance now stares them in the face, unshielded and undeniable. The collapse is not just emotional, it is existential. Avoidants have a way of constructing their identity around the notion that they are self-contained, that they do not need emotional scaffolding from anyone. Their entire sense of self-worth is often built on their perceived ability to remain unaffected by closeness, to navigate life without relying on anyone else. But the empath's exit exposes the fallacy at the heart of that identity. They were never truly independent. They were dependent on the empath's consistency, patience, and emotional labor. Without the empath quietly absorbing the tension and providing emotional safety, the avoidant is confronted with a startling realization. Their emotional world is far more fragile than they ever admitted to themselves. The strategies they used to protect themselves, avoidance, distance, deflection, were never about strength. They were about fear. This realization is deeply disorienting because it undermines the avoidant's foundational beliefs. They have long told themselves that needing someone is weakness, that vulnerability leads to pain, and that detachment equals resilience. Yet the absence of the empath exposes the truth that reliance on another human being is inevitable. The avoidant is forced to acknowledge that they had been navigating life with an illusion of control, and that illusion was maintained only through the empath's unwavering presence. The collapse that follows is often intense and chaotic, manifesting in emotional confusion, heightened anxiety, and an acute awareness of their own limitations. They may feel lost, unable to process the emotions that had long been suppressed, and haunted by the fact that they no longer have someone to soften the blow of intimacy and connection. What makes this confrontation so profound is that it forces the avoidant to experience emotions in their raw, unmediated form. They can no longer push feelings aside, distract themselves, or rationalize their way through the discomfort, the fear, loneliness, and longing they once kept at bay through distance now demand recognition, The absence of the empath removes the buffer that allowed the avoidant to maintain a sense of detachment, leaving them exposed to vulnerability in a way they have never willingly faced. The avoidant suddenly sees that their lifelong strategy of avoidance was never sustainable, and that true emotional independence requires courage, self-awareness, and a willingness to face discomfort, not detachment, denial, or distance. The empath's departure also forces the avoidant to confront the consequences of their behavior in a way that nothing else could. In relationships prior to meeting the empath, the avoidant may have been able to justify their withdrawal, rationalize their detachment, or blame circumstances for relational difficulties. With the empath, this is no longer possible. The empath's love and patience were constant and unwavering, and yet the avoidant still pushed away, resisted closeness, or refused to engage fully. The loss of the empath is therefore a mirror reflecting the avoidant's own actions, highlighting the patterns of avoidance that have long governed their emotional life. They cannot hide behind excuses, external conflicts, or misunderstandings. The departure lays bare the reality that their fear of vulnerability has created tangible consequences. The departure of someone who loved them deeply and patiently, someone who held space for them when they could not hold it for themselves. This confrontation with vulnerability is often both painful and transformative. The avoidant experiences the depth of what they have lost, not just in terms of the person, but in terms of the opportunity for growth and connection. They realize that their avoidance has not made them stronger, it has limited them, leaving them unprepared for authentic intimacy. The super empath was more than a partner. They were a catalyst for the avoidant's potential for emotional expansion. The departure forces the avoidant to grapple with the truth that independence without vulnerability is hollow, and that true emotional resilience comes not from avoidance, but from engaging with fear, discomfort, and connection. The avoidant may respond with denial, defensiveness, or attempts to regain control, but the underlying truth remains inescapable. The fear they have carried their whole life is no longer easily obscured. They are confronted by the reality that they have avoided not just others, but themselves. The absence of the empath exposes the core of their emotional life, demanding reflection and, ultimately, self-awareness. For many avoidants, this is the first time they are forced to face the fact that independence and self-sufficiency are not defined by distance or detachment, but by the ability to confront vulnerability, feel deeply, and take responsibility for one's emotional presence. This forced confrontation is jarring because it reveals that avoidance has been a form of survival, not strength. It challenges the avoidant's sense of identity, shakes their emotional foundations, and demands introspection in a way that is often uncomfortable, disorienting, and unavoidable. The empath's departure is the catalyst for this reckoning, compelling the avoidant to face the truths they have long resisted, that vulnerability is necessary for connection, that dependence is inevitable in meaningful relationships, and that the behaviors they believe protected them have in fact prevented them from experiencing authentic intimacy. The avoidant must navigate this new reality, recognizing that emotional avoidance cannot shield them forever, and that the path toward true independence requires facing the fears they have been running from all along. The loss of the super empath exposes the avoidant's emotional emptiness in a way that is impossible to ignore, because the empath has been quietly filling a void the avoidant has refused to acknowledge. Avoidants often live in a state of internal scarcity, a subtle, almost imperceptible sense that something is missing within themselves. They may not recognize it consciously. In fact, many avoidants pride themselves on seeming complete, self-contained, and unaffected by the emotional turbulence that consumes others. Yet beneath this composed exterior lies a quiet, persistent emptiness, an emotional vacuum that avoidance strategies, distractions, and detachment can mask but never truly fill. The super empath, through their patience, understanding, and gentle attunement, becomes the vessel that sustains this emptiness without judgment. They offer presence, consistency, and unconditional care that the avoidant has never allowed themselves to receive from anyone else, effectively functioning as the emotional support system that the avoidant avoids building internally. The empath's role is often invisible to the avoidant, which is why their absence hits so profoundly. While the avoidant appears detached, even indifferent at times, the empath has been shouldering the emotional load for both of them, translating and buffering feelings, absorbing tension, and providing reassurance in ways the avoidant cannot articulate or manage themselves. Over time, the avoidant becomes subconsciously reliant on this arrangement, believing they are self-sufficient when in reality they are living in a symbiosis they do not recognize. The empath's presence allows the avoidant to navigate their own emotional life with a sense of stability they could not achieve alone. They are able to maintain a facade of control, detachment, and independence precisely because someone else is providing the emotional nourishment they have denied themselves. When the empath finally walks away, the avoidant experiences an abrupt confrontation with the emptiness they have been avoiding. For years, they have pushed away feelings, buried vulnerability, and evaded the depth of their own emotional needs, but the empath's departure leaves no buffer. The carefully maintained equilibrium crumbles, and the avoidant is suddenly faced with the stark reality of what they have neglected within themselves. The void that has always existed is no longer softened by the empath's patience and presence, and it feels enormous, destabilizing, and impossible to ignore. Every unresolved fear, every suppressed desire for connection, every avoided confrontation with vulnerability surfaces all at once, creating a profound sense of inner desolation. This emotional emptiness is compounded by the avoidant's realization that they cannot fill it on their own. Avoidants often avoid intimacy not because they do not want it, but because they do not know how to receive it without fear of being consumed or losing control. They have no internal framework for self-soothing, for processing complex emotions, or for facing vulnerability in a sustainable way. The empath has been, whether consciously or unconsciously, providing that framework, guiding, absorbing, and balancing the emotional currents the avoidant could not manage. When the empath is gone, the avoidant is left to confront the full weight of their own unprocessed feelings, and the absence of a supportive presence magnifies the intensity of the emptiness. It is not merely loneliness, it is a raw, unmediated encounter with the parts of themselves they have spent years suppressing, denying, or avoiding. The avoidant may respond with denial, rationalization, or attempts to regain control, but these are temporary measures. They cannot undo the fact that the empath's departure exposes the gaps in their emotional life. Every pattern of avoidance, every act of detachment, every strategy employed to maintain the illusion of independence is rendered meaningless in the face of this absence. The avoidant can no longer hide behind the illusion that they are unaffected by connection, that they are truly self-reliant, or that emotional engagement is unnecessary. The departure of the empath acts as a mirror, reflecting not just the avoidant's behaviors, but the deep, unmet needs and unresolved emotional deficits they have long ignored. Moreover, this emptiness is particularly jarring because it is paired with a sense of irreversible loss. The empath has left not because the avoidant was unworthy, though the avoidant often interprets it that way, but because the empath recognized the unsustainable nature of carrying the emotional load alone. The avoidant is confronted with the reality that the void they have been unwilling to face is not simply a theoretical concept. It has real-world consequences, manifesting in the absence of the one person who understood and supported them unconditionally. The emptiness is no longer abstract. It is tangible, palpable, and undeniable. It is felt in the quiet moments, in the reflection of what was lost, and in the recognition that the emotional safety they relied upon has been removed. The experience also forces the avoidant to recognize the paradox of their emotional life. They have avoided vulnerability to protect themselves from pain, yet in doing so, they have been dependent on someone else to absorb that very pain for them. The empath's departure removes the safety net, revealing that the avoidance strategies that once felt protective were actually sustaining a fragile equilibrium rather than creating true independence. The void is not simply a gap in the relationship, it is a gap within the avoidant themselves. A space they have been unwilling or unable to fill with self-awareness, emotional processing, and authentic connection. This exposure of emotional emptiness can be disorienting and destabilizing, often provoking intense introspection. The avoidant is forced to confront uncomfortable truths that they have avoided intimacy out of fear rather than choice, that their sense of independence was contingent on someone else's presence, and that their capacity for connection is underdeveloped because they have long resisted it. The absence of the empath strips away the distractions, rationalizations, and defenses, leaving the avoidant face to face with their own vulnerability. The emptiness they feel is not simply the absence of the empath. It is the recognition of the internal deficit they have spent a lifetime avoiding. In this sense, the empath's departure serves as both a revelation and a catalyst. It exposes the avoidant's emotional void in stark clarity, forcing them to see what has been missing within themselves while simultaneously highlighting the unsustainable nature of relying on another to fill that gap. The avoidant is compelled to confront the parts of themselves they have long denied, the fear, the longing, the suppressed desire for connection, and the inability to navigate intimacy without external support. The experience is painful precisely because it is unavoidable. The absence of the empath leaves the avoidant no choice but to face the void they have ignored, a void that cannot be filled externally and must now be reckoned with internally. The avoidant falls apart because the empath's exit is irrefutable proof that intimacy requires reciprocity, presence, and effort, things the avoidant has consistently avoided for years. Avoidants often convince themselves that relationships are optional, that emotional closeness is a choice rather than a necessity, and that they can navigate life independently without the labor of connection. They may build their lives around routines, distractions, and self-reliance, all while maintaining the illusion that intimacy is a risk they are smart enough to avoid. They tell themselves that needing others is a weakness and that dependency is dangerous. Yet, despite all of this, the avoidant is invariably entangled in the emotional currents of the empath's presence, whether they recognize it or not. The empath's patience, consistency, and understanding mask the true labor of intimacy, allowing the avoidant to avoid engagement while still benefiting from a stable connection. This arrangement can continue for years, giving the avoidant the false sense that they can maintain emotional detachment without consequence. The departure of the empath shatters that illusion. When the empath leaves, the avoidant experiences the undeniable reality that intimacy cannot exist without active participation. Relationships require effort, vulnerability, and a willingness to meet someone halfway. For the avoidant, this is a devastating revelation because it exposes the patterns they have relied on for emotional survival. They have avoided vulnerability, withheld their emotions, and resisted closeness, believing that they could maintain connection without giving fully of themselves. The empath's exit proves that this strategy has limits. No matter how patient, loving, or consistent the other person is, intimacy cannot be sustained unilaterally. This realization forces the avoidant to confront the truth about their own behavior. They begin to understand, often with shock, that their withdrawal, detachment, and emotional unavailability were not harmless or neutral. They had real consequences. Every missed opportunity to communicate, every act of distancing, every moment of refusal to engage in emotional labor contributed to the breakdown of the relationship. He empath's departure is a mirror held up to the avoidant, reflecting the impact of their avoidance on someone who gave everything without complaint. It is impossible for the avoidant to rationalize this loss as unrelated to their own actions. The proof is in the absence of the person who once provided unwavering understanding, the person who could no longer continue carrying the emotional weight alone. For the avoidant, this proof is profoundly destabilizing because it confronts them with a contradiction they have long ignored. While they may have believed themselves independent, their survival in the relationship depended entirely on the empath's labor. They relied on the empath's presence to manage the emotional labor they refused to engage in themselves. The empathy, patience, and consistency of the other person created a safety net that allowed the avoidant to maintain the illusion of self-sufficiency. The moment the empath walks away, the avoidant is left exposed to the truth. Relationships demand active participation, and absence, disengagement, or avoidance comes with inevitable consequences. This exposure often triggers a deep and uncomfortable self-awareness. The avoidant realizes that they have been coasting on the generosity and patience of someone who is doing the emotional work for both of them. They begin to see that true intimacy is not about avoidance or detachment. It is about presence, effort, and reciprocity. The empath's exit forces the avoidant to confront the emotional reality they have resisted. They cannot maintain a healthy, meaningful connection without vulnerability and effort. No amount of charm, wit, or strategic withdrawal can replace the fundamental requirements of intimacy. The collapse that follows is not merely emotional, it is structural. The avoidant is forced to reckon with the foundations of their approach to relationships, which are revealed to be insufficient. They see that avoiding conflict, distancing themselves from vulnerability, and rejecting emotional labor has consequences beyond their control. The empath's departure is a proof point that demonstrates a universal truth they have long ignored. Intimacy requires mutual investment. One person's presence, no matter how patient or loving, cannot substitute for the willingness of the other to participate fully. The avoidance coping mechanisms, detachment, withdrawal, and avoidance, are inadequate in the face of a partner who has the awareness and courage to leave when their needs are unmet. The realization is often accompanied by profound regret. The avoidant may reflect on all the moments they could have engaged differently, been more present, or allowed themselves to be vulnerable. They recognize the patterns of avoidance that sabotage the relationship and the missed opportunities to build intimacy. The empath's exit crystallizes these reflections into a stark truth. Relationships are not passive experiences. They are dynamic, requiring attention, empathy, and consistent emotional effort. The avoidant cannot rely on their strategies of detachment to preserve connection, and this recognition is both painful and humbling. Moreover, the avoidant is forced to confront the emotional labor that they have avoided for years. They see that relationships demand constant negotiation, communication, and the courage to face discomfort, all of which they have resisted. The empath's departure demonstrates that love is not a static state, but an active process, one that cannot be sustained unilaterally. The avoidant's habitual avoidance, once effective in preserving their emotional distance, is revealed as a barrier to genuine connection. They understand that intimacy cannot thrive in the absence of mutual effort, and the empath's exit is living proof of. This confrontation often triggers a cascading effect of self-reflection and emotional reckoning. The avoidant begins to see that their pattern of avoidance has created a recurring cycle. The push for independence, the resistance to vulnerability, and the reliance on others to absorb emotional labor inevitably lead to loss. The empath's departure is the culmination of this cycle, exposing the consequences in a way that is undeniable. The avoidant is forced to acknowledge the limits of avoidance, the cost of emotional detachment, and the necessity of engagement. They realize that the ability to connect deeply and sustain meaningful relationships requires presence, reciprocity, and effort, the very qualities they have resisted but now see as essential. The intensity of this realization is heightened because it cannot be ignored or rationalized away. Unlike conflict or criticism, which can be dismissed or minimized, the absence of the empath is absolute and tangible. The avoidant sees with clarity that intimacy demands more than superficial gestures, emotional detachment, or passive reliance. The departure is a vivid, irrefutable demonstration that avoidance has consequences, that effort is required, and that genuine connection cannot be maintained without mutual investment. It is this undeniable truth that triggers the collapse, forcing the avoidant to confront the limitations of their coping mechanisms and the necessity of emotional engagement. And so, when the super empath walks away, the avoidant is left not just with absence, but with reflection. They are confronted with the truths they spent a lifetime avoiding, their fear, their patterns, their hidden dependencies, and the emptiness they refuse to acknowledge. The loss exposes the reality that intimacy is not optional, that love requires effort, vulnerability, and mutual presence, and that running for connection comes with a price. It is a painful awakening, but also a profound opportunity. For in this confrontation, there lies the potential for growth, self-awareness, and the courage to finally face what has been avoided for too long. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for opening your hearts to these truths. May we all learn to recognize the value of emotional presence, to honor the people who hold space for us, and to face vulnerability with courage. Thank you, truly, for being here today.